The room smells like blood and burned meat. 4 men are gripping a patient to the table, one at each shoulder, one at each knee, and the patient is screaming before the blade even touches skin. The surgeon doesn't pause. He can't. Every second the patient stays open is a second closer to death by shock, by blood loss, by the body simply giving up from the trauma of what is happening to it. The fastest surgeons in London and Paris were celebrated like athletes. Robert Liston could amputate a leg in 28 seconds. That wasn't a party trick. That was mercy. Speed was the only mercy that existed. The smell of burned flesh follows cauterization. The smell of the infection that caused all this hangs underneath everything. There are no painkillers. There is no silence. There is only the table, the restraints, the screaming, and the clock. The last time you had a tooth pulled, you felt a pinch, maybe a little pressure. You drove yourself home. That gap between the screaming room and the dentist's chair is the story we're telling today. Stories like these never made it into the textbooks most of us grew up with. If this kind of hidden history pulls at something in you, you're in exactly the right place. We publish a new story like this every single week. Subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. Before we talk about what finally ended it, we need to spend some time inside that world. Not just to appreciate the contrast, but because the history of surgical pain is genuinely stranger, more frustrating, and more human than most people realize. The answer, the chemical answer that would eventually end the screaming, was sitting in a lab, then at a party, then in a published notebook for decades before anyone used it. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Start with the scale. Surgery before anesthesia wasn't an unusual event reserved for extreme circumstances. It was everywhere. Teeth rotted and had to come out by force, with pliers, by a barber surgeon who also cut your hair. Tumors grew on necks, jaws, limbs, and torsos, and if you wanted to survive them, someone had to cut them free while you were awake. Amputations were the signature surgery of the era. Battlefield wounds, infected limbs, gangrenous feet from poorly managed wounds that had been left too long. Women died in childbirth from complications that required surgical intervention. Bladder stones, a remarkably common affliction in this period due to diet and water quality, required a procedure called lithotomy, an incision made directly through the perineum to extract the stone while the patient was fully conscious and begging for it to stop. These weren't rare. These were routine, and every single one of them was performed on a patient who was awake, aware, and in complete agony. The death toll from the surgery itself was significant, but the death toll from pain is harder to count and somehow worse. Patients could die from shock, not from blood loss, not from infection, but from the pure neurological catastrophe of experiencing extreme trauma without any buffer. The body has limits. When pain exceeds them, the cardiovascular system can simply collapse, which means the screaming wasn't just horrible to witness. The screaming was itself killing people. Surgeons knew this. They were not, by and large, indifferent to their patients' suffering. Many of them were deeply troubled by it. What they lacked was a solution, so they adapted to the reality. The entire culture of surgery adapted to the reality. Faster was better, not just for the patient's psychology, but for the patient's survival. Robert Liston's 28-second amputation was famous not as a curiosity, but as a professional standard. The operating theater at University College London drew crowds. Speed mattered. Precision, which requires time, was a secondary concern. If you are operating through screaming, through thrashing, through a patient held down by 4 men, surgical subtlety is largely impossible. What did patients do? They delayed. That's the part that gets lost. The rational response to knowing what surgery felt like was to put it off for as long as humanly possible. Patients with conditions that required surgery, infected teeth, abscesses, tumors, bladder stones, would wait, and wait, and wait. They would manage with laudanum, an opium tincture that dulled the worst edges of chronic pain but did nothing for acute surgical pain. They would wait until the infection spread, until the condition became septic, until they were so weakened by illness that the surgery itself became more dangerous, not less. Some patients made a quiet calculation and chose to die of the original condition rather than face the table. That was a rational choice. It is impossible to understand the history of anesthesia without sitting with that fact for a moment. People chose death over surgery, not out of weakness, not out of ignorance, but out of a clear-eyed assessment of what surgery actually involved. That assessment was correct. The operating theater itself made things stranger. Surgery in this era was frequently a public event. Medical schools ran amphitheaters, literal tiered seating built around a central operating table where students and observers watched procedures performed on conscious patients. The sounds were part of the education. The screaming was expected. It was documented. It was normalized. Some accounts from medical students of the period describe attending their first operation with the same sense of bracing dread a modern person might associate with something entirely different, and understanding that what they were about to witness was going to be genuinely traumatic. And layered beneath the practical horror was a philosophical and theological resistance to the very idea of painless surgery. This was not fringe thinking. It had institutional weight. Pain, in a certain widely held view, was not a design flaw. It was a design feature, a moral and even spiritual component of the human condition. Suffering purified, suffering taught. To remove pain from surgery was, in this view, to tamper with something that was not supposed to be tampered with. The most explicit version of this argument would resurface later, when anesthesia during childbirth was proposed, and religious figures argued specifically that the pain of labor was scripturally required, that to relieve it was to defy God. That argument had real social power. It slowed adoption even after the chemistry was solved. But the chemistry took a long time to get to, and the early attempts to solve the problem of surgical pain are a case study in how close a civilization can come to solving something crucial and still miss it entirely. Opium is the oldest pharmaceutical pain intervention in recorded history. Poppy cultivation in Mesopotamia dates to roughly 3,400 BCE, and the Sumerians called the poppy plant Hul-Gil, joy plant. Egypt used it. Ancient Greece used it. It worked, to a degree, for chronic pain, for grief, for the kind of dull, persistent suffering that could be chemically managed. It did not work for surgery. Opium sedates and dulls. It does not eliminate the sensation of a blade cutting through muscle and hitting bone. Patients given opium before surgery were still conscious, still reactive, still in agony, just slightly more manageable. Mandrake root, soaked in wine and consumed before a procedure, was used across the ancient Mediterranean world. The mandragora plant contains scopolamine and atropine, which have genuine sedative properties. In the right dose, under the right conditions, a patient might be made groggy, disoriented, less aware of what was happening. In the wrong dose, which was common because the concentration of active compounds in the plant varies wildly, it was toxic. Mandrake killed patients who were trying to endure surgery. It was unpredictable enough that it could not be relied upon, but it kept being used because the alternative was nothing. Medieval European physicians developed what they called the soporific sponge, a cloth or sponge soaked in a mixture of substances including opium, henbane, hemlock, and occasionally mandrake, held beneath a patient's nose before surgery with the intention of inducing unconsciousness through inhalation. Texts from the period describe this practice. Whether it actually worked in any reliable sense is genuinely uncertain. The dosing was impossible to control. The active compound concentrations were unknown, and the historical record of patient outcomes is incomplete. It got used. It sometimes helped. It sometimes killed. It was not a solution. In ancient China, the physician Hua Tuo reportedly performed abdominal surgeries using a compound called mafeisan, a powder mixed into wine that allegedly produced a state of deep unconsciousness sufficient for surgery. The problem is that the formula for mafeisan died with Hua Tuo in the 3rd century CE. Whatever it contained, cannabis has been proposed, as has datura, aconite, and several other compounds. It was never reconstructed. That thread simply ends. Whatever knowledge existed there did not survive. What about alcohol? Alcohol gets brought up constantly in discussions of pre-anesthetic surgery, usually with the implication that at least they had that. Here is the thing: alcohol does not anesthetize, it disinhibits. A drunk surgical patient is not a sedated surgical patient. They are a less cooperative surgical patient who is still fully conscious and reactive to pain, now with impaired judgment and a higher chance of fighting the restraints. Rum before amputation made the social dimension of the procedure slightly different. It did not make the experience of amputation different in any meaningful way. Compression helped, in a narrow sense. Tourniquets applied tightly to a limb before amputation could reduce sensation in the limb by limiting blood flow and compressing nerves. This worked well enough in some cases to partially numb the surgical site, not enough to eliminate pain, but enough to slow the worst of it. It also caused significant tissue damage, and it solved nothing for surgeries involving the torso, head, or abdomen, which is where most of the truly dangerous conditions lived. The strangest and most genuinely compelling early approach came not from chemistry, but from the mind. In the 1840s, a Scottish surgeon named James S. Daly was working in India, and he began performing surgeries on patients placed into hypnotic trance, which was then called Mesmerism. S. Daly documented hundreds of procedures, including major amputations performed on patients who showed dramatically reduced pain response. His results were recorded. His outcomes were measurable. Patients who underwent surgery under S. Daly's hypnotic method had significantly lower mortality rates than comparable patients operated on without it. The European medical establishment dismissed him. Not because his results were bad, they were good, but because the mechanism was inexplicable by the science of the day. Mesmerism had a reputation problem, associated more with theatrical charlatans than with medicine. S. Daly was, for most of his career, treated as a curiosity or a fraud. The cases went into the record and largely stayed there. Here is where the history becomes genuinely maddening. By the early 19th century, the chemistry required to solve the problem of surgical pain already existed, not in draft form, not in theoretical speculation. The actual compounds that would eventually end the screaming had already been synthesized, inhaled, studied, and written about. The connection simply had not been made. Joseph Priestley synthesized nitrous oxide in 1772. Humphrey Davy, one of the most celebrated scientists in England, inhaled it extensively in 1799, recreationally, experimentally, with great enthusiasm, and wrote in his published notes that nitrous oxide might have the capacity to suppress surgical pain. He wrote this in a published book, and then he moved on to other interests, and nobody followed the thread. Ether had been known since the 16th century. By the 1830s and 1840s, inhaling ether for recreation was a documented social practice. These were called ether frolics, parties where participants passed around a cloth soaked in ether and inhaled it for the giddy, floating sensation it produced. People fell down at these parties. People hurt themselves at these parties. And those same people lying on the floor with fresh bruises they had not felt happen would laugh and observe that the ether seemed to have prevented them from feeling the impact. This was noticed. It was discussed. It was not connected to surgery. The chemistry was in the room. It had been in the room for decades. At parties, in published notebooks, on laboratory shelves. And somewhere in the gap between what was known and what was applied, thousands of people climbed onto the table, gripped the leather straps, and screamed. The answer was already there. The question was who would finally make the connection, and why it would take the shape it did when they finally did. The date was October 16, 1846. The room was Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston, and the space set aside for the demonstration was called, with no apparent irony, the Ether Dome. A 20-year-old printer named Gilbert Abbott was in the chair. He had a vascular tumor on the left side of his jaw. The surgeon, John Collins Warren, was one of the most respected men in American medicine. He was also, at this particular moment, deeply skeptical of what he was about to witness. A dentist named William Morton had asked permission to try something. Warren, who had spent a career operating on screaming patients and had no reason to believe this morning would be different, agreed, perhaps out of curiosity, perhaps out of the kind of tired resignation that comes from decades of watching people suffer on your table. Morton was late. The audience of medical students and surgeons in the gallery above began to murmur. Warren, with a dry wit sharpened by long experience, told the room that, as Morton had not appeared, he supposed he was otherwise engaged. Morton arrived. He administered ether to Gilbert Abbott through an inhaler he had designed himself, a glass globe with a wooden mouthpiece filled with ether-soaked sponges. Abbott breathed. Abbott went under. Warren made the incision, and the room, which should have been full of screaming, was completely silent. Warren removed the tumor. Abbott remained still. When it was over, Abbott woke and said that he had felt no pain, that he had been aware of something happening, a sensation of scraping, but nothing more. Warren turned to the gallery and delivered what became one of the most quoted lines in the history of medicine. "Gentlemen," he said, "this is no humbug." Within 2 months, the procedure had been replicated in London. Within a year, it had spread across Europe. The world had changed, and it had changed in a single public morning. But the story of who deserves credit for that morning is considerably messier than the clean triumph it appears to be. 4 years before Morton's demonstration in 1842 in Jefferson, Georgia, a physician named Crawford Long used ether to remove a cyst from the neck of a patient named James Venable. Venable woke up, felt nothing, and reportedly asked when Long was going to begin. Long had already finished. Long knew what he had. He used ether for several more procedures over the following years, and then he did something that would cost him his place in history. He didn't tell anyone. He didn't publish. He didn't demonstrate publicly. He quietly practiced in rural Georgia, treating patients without pain, and kept no systematic record for outside eyes. By the time Long published his findings in 1849, the world had already given the credit to Morton. He spent years trying to reclaim his place in history and largely failed. There is now a statue of Crawford Long in the United States Capitol. Most Americans have never heard of him. Then there is Horace Wells. Wells was a dentist in Hartford, Connecticut, and a colleague of Morton's. In 1844, he attended a public demonstration of nitrous oxide, laughing gas, the same substance Humphrey Davy had identified as a potential anesthetic 45 years earlier, without acting on the insight. Wells watched a man at the demonstration injure his leg under the gas and feel nothing. He recognized immediately what this meant. He arranged his own demonstration at Harvard Medical School in January of 1845, with a patient requiring a tooth extraction. The gas was administered. The patient cried out during the procedure. The audience of medical students laughed and hissed. Wells was dismissed as a fraud. He hadn't failed because the idea was wrong. Nitrous oxide does work. The dose was likely insufficient, or the patient was under-sedated for that particular procedure. But the public failure destroyed him. Wells abandoned dentistry. He descended into what his contemporaries described as a mental collapse. He died in 1848 by suicide in a New York jail cell after a period of erratic behavior, including a chloroform habit he had developed while experimenting on himself. He was 33 years old. He never knew that his idea had been right all along, that laughing gas would eventually become a staple of dental offices around the world, that every child who has ever floated through a tooth extraction on nitrous oxide owes something to a Hartford dentist who died thinking he was a failure. Morton's own story is not much tidier. After his triumph at the Ether Dome, he attempted to patent ether under a made-up name, Lithion. to obscure its composition so he could profit from it exclusively. Surgeons quickly identified the smell and the chemistry. The patent was contested. The credit disputes consumed him. He spent the rest of his life in legal battles, financial ruin, and escalating bitterness, trying to extract money from a discovery that had already escaped his control and entered the world without asking his permission. He died in 1868, at 48, broke and exhausted, having never received the compensation or recognition he believed he was owed. 3 men had their hands on the answer. 1 stayed silent. 1 was humiliated. 1 was consumed by his own ambition, and the world was transformed anyway. The reason the 1846 demonstration succeeded where earlier attempts had failed was not chemistry. The chemistry was the same. Ether had been sitting in laboratories and at recreational parties, the so-called ether frolics of the 1830s and 40s, where attendees inhaled the vapor and staggered around laughing and colliding with furniture for decades. People had noticed during those parties that injuries sustained under ether produced no pain response at the time. The observation was made and dismissed, and made again and dismissed again, and written off as a curiosity of intoxication. What made 1846 different was the setting. The procedure was public. It was performed in front of credentialed surgeons at a respected institution. The result was witnessed by people whose word the medical world trusted, and it was written up in journals immediately. The Boston Medical and Surgical Journal published an account within weeks. Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr., physician and poet, wrote to Morton suggesting the word anesthesia to describe what had occurred, from the Greek for without sensation. The word stuck. The practice spread. Speed of adoption, in this case, came from legitimacy. All the earlier observations had lacked that. Mesmerist James S. Daly had performed hundreds of surgeries in India using hypnotic trance in the 1840s with genuinely documented success, and the European medical establishment had dismissed him as a fraud or a showman. Crawford Long had the results but not the platform. Horace Wells had the platform but not the outcome. Morton, whatever his personal failings, had both at once in the right room, in front of the right audience. A year after Morton's demonstration, a Scottish obstetrician named James Young Simpson introduced something even more powerful: chloroform. Simpson and 2 colleagues inhaled it at his dinner table, again the experimental setting of a recreational gathering, and all 3 passed out. When they came to, Simpson recognized immediately that this was faster, smoother, and easier to administer than ether. Chloroform required no special inhaler. A cloth would do. A few drops, and a patient was under. Chloroform spread rapidly through Europe, but it carried resistance that ether had not yet fully faced. The resistance came from religion. The book of Genesis was explicit. Women would bring forth children in pain. Clergymen argued that chloroform in childbirth was a violation of divine decree, an interference with the punishment God had specifically designated for women since Eden. This was not a fringe position. It had real social weight, real medical adherence, and real consequences for women who were denied relief from labor pain on theological grounds. Then, in April of 1853, Queen Victoria used chloroform during the birth of her 8th child, Prince Leopold. Her physician, John Snow, who would later become famous for a completely different contribution to medicine involving a cholera outbreak and a water pump, administered the anesthetic. Victoria described the effect as soothing, quieting, and delightful beyond measure. The argument collapsed, not from new science, not from clinical data, from the fact that the Queen had done it and called it delightful. If the moral weight of a monarch's public choice could not sustain the religious case for mandatory suffering in childbirth, nothing could. The resistance dissolved faster than the theology that had built it. What followed was not just a medical shift, it was a civilizational one. Surgery changed its relationship to the body. Before anesthesia, the interior of the human body was largely inaccessible, not because surgeons lacked the anatomical knowledge, but because operating on an awake, writhing, terrified patient while also fighting the clock made any procedure requiring time and precision effectively impossible. With anesthesia, surgeons could slow down, they could look, they could consider. The careful, deliberate surgery that eventually gave rise to modern cardiac surgery, neurosurgery, orthopedic reconstruction, and organ transplantation was only possible because a patient could be made still and kept that way for hours. Mortality did not drop immediately. Infections continued to kill patients at devastating rates. That battle against sepsis and contamination belonged to Ignaz Semmelweis and Joseph Lister and came separately, sometimes in parallel. But the precision that anesthesia enabled made the eventual success of sterile technique matter in ways it never could have while surgeons were still racing against screaming. The two revolutions needed each other. Here is the human fact that gets lost in the story of the Ether Dome and Queen Victoria and the patent disputes. The people who gained the most from anesthesia were the ones who had been suffering the longest and the most silently. The farmer whose infected tooth had been rotting for months because he could not face extraction now had a different calculation to make. The woman in labor who had been told her pain was sacred and required now had a queen on her side. The child facing a necessary amputation who had no framework for understanding what was about to happen to them could now be spared the full catastrophe of it. The soldiers on future battlefields, the patients in future hospitals facing procedures that had not been invented yet because they first required the stillness that anesthesia made possible. The screaming operating theater did not vanish overnight. It took years for the practice to reach rural practitioners, to become standard equipment to be taught reliably in medical schools. Plenty of patients in the 1850s and the 1860s still went under the knife without adequate anesthesia, or without any at all. The history of access to pain relief follows, not surprisingly, the same fault lines as the history of access to everything else. The wealthy and well-connected received it sooner. Others waited. But the door had opened. And once it opened, the practice of surgery could never fully go back through it. The word anesthesia is used so casually now that it barely registers. It is a form on a clipboard before an outpatient procedure. It is the voice of an anesthesiologist telling you to count backward from 10, and then nothing. And then you are awake, and it is already over. It is so embedded in the expectation of medicine that its absence is unimaginable. You cannot picture lying on a table in complete agony while someone cuts you open because the entire architecture of modern surgical experience has been built to make that scenario unthinkable. That is the thing about the most consequential technologies. They do not announce themselves. They do not stay dramatic. They become ordinary so quickly and so completely that the world they replaced begins to seem like a strange fiction, like something that could not really have been true. And yet it was true for virtually all of human history that if your body needed to be cut open to save your life, you would be awake for every second of it. A dentist showed up late to a demonstration in Boston. A tumor was removed in silence. A surgeon told a room full of skeptics that this was no humbug, and the screaming stopped.